he was elected overwhelmingly, although there were other candidates. Has been a very popular person. He is quite liberal on LGBT issues, women issues, poverty, and all kinds of other issues. But he is able to charm people in a way because he's so warm, witty, funny, and people will listen to him even if they disagree with him. If you can see this picture of Bishop Curry, he's almost the stereotype of a really, really likable black preacher, but he's a very wily and resourceful and witty preacher. And this book is 13 sermons that he gave when he was Bishop of North Carolina for 15 years, each given at an annual convention of the diocese. And I have chosen 3 of those sermons that particularly struck me as wonderfully crazy, and I want to share them with you, comment upon them with you. The very first sermon, the title is "We Need Some Crazy Christians." He says we must be as crazy as Jesus, but we have always tried to force him into our own twisted, conventional sanity and made Jesus something quite other than he is, quite much tamer, much more fitting in to what we want him to be. The most dramatic example I can think of that, and it fits in with our emphasis on women's achievements this month, is the fact that throughout Jesus' ministry he was remarkably accepting of women as equals, certainly for his time and his place, his religious tradition. There are many examples in the Gospels of him dealing with women in a way that a religious leader was not supposed to deal with them, taking them seriously, listening to them, interacting with them. And most scholars think there really were women among his disciples, but these were removed later. For a while, in the first couple of generations, women were very much leaders in the church and had the equivalent of being priests and other leadership roles. But as time went on, the church got larger and more formal and tried to fit in more with the patriarchal society in which it lived. Women were shoved aside and were taken away from leadership positions. And they have only regained these to some degree in the late 20th and the 21st century. And even there, by no means universally, has that happened. I'm sure that Jesus is delighted with this development, for we are going back to a very primitive state, to him, to the earliest days of the church, and removing some of the grotesque innovations of misogyny and suppression of women that crept in for all those hundreds and thousands of years in between. The patriarchy is the innovation that obscured Jesus. It's not Jesus. And that's a very dramatic example, the most dramatic that I can imagine. Another way of taming Jesus' madness so that we are more comfortable with it is to interpret Jesus through the Old Testament, rather than interpreting the Old Testament through Jesus, which makes Jesus much harsher. One example of this was in the latest issue of the Lutheran magazine, of the ELCA, in an article written by Pastor Beth Wartick, a young pastor in Iowa. This photograph, which I know you can't see, shows her presiding over communion. If you could see it closer, you'll notice she has no left arm. She was born without a left arm. And she mentions in this article that when she's about 10, her parents told her that when they took her to the Lutheran Church as an infant, a very devout member of the church told them that they need to think about what sin they had done that made God punish them by taking their daughter's arm away. This person was quite sincere, but of course quite wrong. And the parents never thought that, nor the pastor, and certainly Pastor Wartick doesn't believe that is an advocate in the ELCA for people with disabilities, a very outspoken advocate. But if you think in terms of the Old Testament, people with such disabilities were banned from leadership, were regarded as having been the victims of God's anger, and a result of punishment. And this was really standard view. Jesus sharply disagreed with that, and very obviously disagreed. For example, he was asked about a blind man, did his parents sin? And Jesus said it was not due to anyone's sin that this man is blind. And he says other things like that. Again, it's very clear that he's going on a different path. But again, many people either ignore this or forget it or whatever, and reinterpret Jesus through a harshness of the Old Testament that is not him. I have shocked people when I say that Jesus would never send the 10 plagues on to kill the firstborn, the plague to kill the firstborn of all Egyptians. That he who said, love your enemies and Father forgive them, that is of a different spirit. And it again is an example of how he really is crazily different, but there's such an effort to make him fit into what we think he should be. And we must try to stop remaking him into our twisted, harsh sanity. Well, my favorite of these 13 sermons by Bishop Curry has the title, The Gospel Witness of Welcome Will Rearrange the World. In this, Bishop Curry calls for Christians to be radically welcome. And he said that is really the heart of the gospel and the heart of our calling, to be as radically welcome as Jesus was. And that would be something. In the gospel, Jesus welcomes everyone that he should not be welcoming, but even should be condemning and kicking out. He accepted sinners, which meant that people who did not follow the law adequately, tax collectors, lepers, the poor, even prostitutes, and all kinds of people, even Samaritans and others who were not supposed to be accepted at all by good religious Jews. Well, in the years since then, the church has become much more conventionally saying in who it will accept. Of course, we all here know that very well. For a number of years, as some of you know, I went to the Kirkridge Retreat Center in Pennsylvania for many retreats for gays. And this was in the 1990s, through the height of the AIDS crisis. And I heard many, many examples of how gay men had been brutally rejected by their church and by their families on the basis of the church, with the idea that, well, God and his son Jesus rejected gays, and therefore they should be rejected by everyone else. And this was a sincere but a terribly distorted failure of radical welcoming. It's radical exclusion. The one group that may have been more excluded, of course, are transgender. Their fate among Christianity and even Lutherans has been so bad, and still really is, that it makes gays and lesbians' fate seem comparatively mild. Recently, the Lutheran magazine recommended a book called Transforming by a transgender, Austin Hartke, who identifies as a transgender man. That was not always his identity or his name. And the rest of the title of Transforming is The Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians. In 12 chapters, Austin makes very clear what it is like to be a transgender Christian. And he gives his own experience and other transgender just how very difficult it is. The very fact that he graduated with honors from the seminary and is now essentially an advocate for transgenders in the ELCA shows something, but the fact that there is such a need for him and for such a book indicates that radical welcoming is just beginning. And the book is interesting. I think it would be hard for a lot of people. I mean, I originally was very, very ignorant about transgender, not that I'm so smart now. I think that what would have to happen is to know some transgender people. What was most helpful to me was James Terry, those of you who know him. And I got to know him fairly well and still keep in touch with him. And he, more than anything else, was a transforming experience. So I'm not excusing people who are so ignorant and so cruel to transgender, but I do realize that this is quite a step from what has been a deep tradition. But again, it isn't just LGBT, but there are all sorts of people that the church has not welcomed. And the point that Bishop Curry does not deal with LGBT and transgender, but he makes the point that welcoming has to be more than just being nice and saying polite things. If we welcome devalued people, we must advocate for them openly and give practical help more than just meaningless words and gestures. And that certainly is true. Radical welcome, I think, would be a good summary of our call and what Jesus wants us to do, to be as radically welcoming as he most certainly was. Well, the third sermon that I want to mention and conclude with has the title, We Are Part of Something Greater Than Ourselves. Certainly it's easy to be discouraged by the size and the severe challenges that following crazy Jesus involves. But he reminds us that we are part of a much larger world, certainly of God himself, of Jesus, and with Christians of all kinds who are an army of craziness. We are not isolated. We are not alone. And if we think that we are, we don't understand. I would go farther than Bishop Curry would go and say that Jesus does not just deal with all kinds of Christians, but with Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus, people of no formal faith, even atheists, to further his work of justice and peace and compassion. God does this, and Jesus do this outside and even fighting against the church when they have to. And often they have had to do that, and certainly the advances for LGBT have not come from the church initially, or for women, or for blacks, or for so many other groups. The churches are tagged along later, more or less, some, after. Beginnings come from outside the formal church, or from dissenting groups within the church. So this effort goes on no matter how much the church might not want it to. So we need to remind us that we are part of something much bigger that cannot be defeated. I suppose we've all heard this statement that Martin Luther King Jr. liked to say: the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So there is this movement toward a more wholesome world, sane in the view of God and Jesus, but insane by the conventional standards, that cannot ultimately be stopped. It's part of the fundamental movement of the universe. Well, so, to sum up, Jesus is crazy. We must stop making him conventionally sane, or seem that way. Radical welcome needs to be the heart, literally, of our calling as crazy Jesus people, and not merely in words, but in practical help and advocacy. And we are part of a vast, powerful movement of Jesus' craziness, and must never forget this. Well, in conclusion, I do want to read one verse of Glory Be to Jesus, L9. It's a hymn new to me, but I think it's quite powerful in the simplicity. And in the fourth verse, I want to repeat: let us pledge together, answering Christ's call. Let us be like Jesus, healers, prophets, all. Let us be like the crazy Jesus, the gospel crazy Jesus.